Welcome to your deep dive on learning English with podcasts. We've got this awesome guide, and honestly, even native speakers might find some cool tips here. Forget those boring textbooks. Let's unlock fluency with something way more fun. Podcasts. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely. What I find fascinating about this guide is its practical approach. It breaks down the whole learning process into clear steps that anyone can follow, no matter their level.
Okay, let's unpack this. It all starts with choosing the right podcast, which I know from experience is so important. It's like finding the perfect pair of shoes, not one size fits all. The guide suggests starting with podcasts made for English learners, especially if you're just starting out. Why is that so important?
Think of it this way. Starting with podcasts designed for learners is like having training wheels. These podcasts are usually slower paced, and the hosts often explain vocabulary and grammar as they go. This creates a really structured environment where you can build a solid foundation. A great example is Think Straight podcast, which focuses on breaking down conversational English.
That makes total sense. Starting with a structured approach can really boost your confidence. But what happens when you're ready to ditch the training wheels and really challenge yourself?
That's where native level podcasts come in. The guide suggests choosing podcasts that cover topics you're already passionate about. It could be anything: news, history, true crime, comedy, business, even those super specific hobbies you have. Finding something you genuinely enjoy ensures you stay engaged, and that's crucial for effective learning.
So we've found our podcast, we're excited about the topics, but how do we make sure we're actually learning and not just passively listening? This guide emphasizes setting realistic goals, and I think that's something a lot of people struggle with. What does a realistic goal look like for someone just starting out versus someone who's more advanced?
It's all about aligning your goals with your current level and being honest about where you are in your journey. For beginners, a realistic goal might be simply understanding the main topic of the podcast and picking out a few keywords. Can you get the gist of what's being said? That's a fantastic starting point.
Small steps lead to big wins, right? What about those who are maybe at an intermediate level?
Intermediate learners can step it up a notch. They could focus on understanding more details, following the conversations more closely, and identifying new vocabulary words. It's about pushing your boundaries a little, but not so much that you get overwhelmed.
And for those who are already quite comfortable with English, the advanced learners.
For those who are already fluent, it's about mastering those finer points of the language. Think about idioms, slang, or even those tiny but important differences in pronunciation. They might even start to pick up on different accents and how that affects the spoken language.
So it's really a journey, not a race, right? And this guide emphasizes the importance of active listening, which I think is a game changer. It even calls out a common mistake, just having a podcast on in the background without really paying attention. What are some techniques it suggests for making sure you're actively engaged?
It offers some really great strategies. One of the most classic but effective techniques is taking notes. As you're listening, jot down new words and phrases that catch your attention. You don't even have to look them up right away. The simple act of writing them down helps cement them in your memory.
I'm a visual learner, so anything that involves actually seeing the words really helps me. What other active listening gems does the guide offer?
Another powerful technique is to hit pause and repeat any sentences you find challenging. It's like rewinding your comprehension. By repeating what you hear, you start to internalize the natural rhythm and flow of English, which is crucial for sounding more like a native speaker.
It's like practicing your lines in a play, getting all those nuances just right. Any other techniques that stand out to you?
One that I find particularly interesting is called shadowing. It involves mimicking the speaker's pronunciation by repeating sentences right after they say them. I know it might sound a little strange at first, but it's incredibly effective for improving your pronunciation and fluency.
Shadowing sounds like it could really help break down those pronunciation barriers. It's almost like having a personal language coach right there in your headphones. And speaking of helpful tools, this guide also highlights the often overlooked power of transcripts and subtitles, especially for visual learners.
That's right, they are a fantastic resource, especially when used strategically.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, especially for someone like me who learns best visually. How can we use transcripts and subtitles effectively to supercharge our learning?
The guide breaks it down into a simple three-step process. First, listen to the podcast without the transcript. To assess your initial understanding, how much can you grasp just by listening?
It's like a little pop quiz before you get the answer key. What's step 2?
Next, listen again, this time with the transcript right in front of you. This lets you catch anything you might have missed in the first round and really focus on those tricky words or phrases that tripped you up initially.
It's like having a safety net so you don't miss any important details. Okay, so we've listened twice, once without and once with the transcript. What's the final step?
Finally, take some time to just read through the transcript on its own. This step solidifies your understanding of the language used in the podcast, and it allows you to really focus on any new vocabulary or grammar structures without the distraction of the audio.
It's like a deep dive into the language itself, detached from the audio. What about subtitles? How do those fit into this strategy?
Subtitles, especially on platforms like YouTube, are fantastic because they add another layer of visual cues. You not only see the words, but you can also see the speaker's facial expressions and body language, which can give you a deeper understanding of the tone and context of what's being said. It's almost like having a visual dictionary come to life.
So we're actively listening, taking notes, shadowing like pros, and utilizing transcripts and subtitles. This is an amazing toolkit for anyone learning English. But learning doesn't have to be a solo mission. The guide also suggests finding a language partner to listen to the same podcast episode. What are the benefits of this, and how can someone find a language partner if they don't already have one?
Learning with a buddy always makes things more enjoyable, and this guide really highlights the power of collaboration. Discussing the podcast episode with a partner lets you reinforce what you've learned, and it gives you a chance to actually use the language in a real-world setting. You can brainstorm about new vocabulary, role-play conversations from the podcast, even debate different viewpoints presented in the episode.
It's like having your own built-in study group, which can make the learning process so much more fun. But finding a language partner can be a little daunting, especially if you're just starting out. Where do you even begin?
There are so many great resources available these days. Language exchange apps and online forums dedicated to language learning are fantastic places to connect with people who share your goals. You can find partners from all over the world, which adds another layer of cultural exchange to the learning experience.
That's incredible. Learning English while connecting with people from different cultures, it's a win-win. And speaking of finding what excites you, this guide emphasizes the importance of choosing podcasts on topics that genuinely spark your interest.
That's so important. Passion fuels engagement, and when you're genuinely interested in a topic, you're much more likely to be present and absorb the information. It's about making learning enjoyable, not a chore.
I love that idea. It transforms language learning from a task into an exciting exploration. Does the guide offer any tips for incorporating variety into your podcast choices so you don't get stuck in a rut?
Absolutely. One suggestion is to create playlists based on different topics. This diversifies your vocabulary and exposes you to a range of conversational styles. One day, you might be immersed in the world of science podcasts, and the next day, you could be listening to interviews with musicians or entrepreneurs. It keeps things fresh and exciting.
Creating a language learning playlist, that's brilliant. It's like curating your own personal English immersion experience.
Exactly. And finally, to really solidify this whole podcast learning strategy, the guide emphasizes the importance of consistency and tracking your progress.
Those are the final two pieces of the puzzle, right? Making it a habit and celebrating those milestones along the way. What specifically does the guide recommend for making this a regular part of your life?
Consistency is key. Make podcast listening a part of your daily or weekly routine, even if it's just for 15-30 minutes a day. You can listen while commuting, exercising, cooking, even doing chores. It's about weaving those moments of English immersion into your everyday life.
It's about finding those little pockets of time to connect with the language. What about tracking your progress? How can we make sure we're actually moving forward and not just spinning our wheels?
There are a few strategies you can use. Keeping a vocabulary list is a really visual way to see all those new words you're learning. You can also challenge yourself by gradually moving towards more advanced podcasts as you improve. And don't forget to revisit older episodes that you might have struggled with initially. You'll be amazed at how much easier they are to understand as your skills develop.
It's like leveling up in a language learning game. What a fantastic set of tips and techniques for making the most of podcasts for learning English. We've covered a lot of ground in part one of this deep dive. From finding the right podcasts and setting realistic goals to active listening techniques, and even embracing the power of transcripts and subtitles.
Absolutely. And remember, language learning should be enjoyable. Finding topics that you're passionate about, connecting with a language partner, and celebrating your progress along the way can make all the difference. It's all about embracing the journey and finding what works best for you.
We'll be back in just a bit for part two of this deep dive. where we'll explore even more strategies and tips to help you unlock fluency and make learning English with podcasts a fun and rewarding experience.
Welcome back to our deep dive on learning English with podcasts. In part one, we covered a lot of ground, from choosing the right podcasts and setting those all-important goals to active listening and even harnessing the power of transcripts and subtitles.
We also talked about how finding a language partner can add a whole new dimension to the learning experience. It's like having a teammate on your quest for fluency.
Exactly. And remember, all of these fantastic tips and insights are coming straight from this guide we've been diving into, a roadmap for anyone looking to boost their English skills through the magic of podcasts.
It's such a practical and engaging guide. I'm already putting some of these techniques to work in my own language learning.
Very fantastic. It's all about finding what clicks for you and weaving those strategies into your daily life. Speaking of routines, the guide really hammers home the importance of consistency. It's not about cramming in hours of listening all at once. It's about making podcast listening a regular part of your life, even if it's just a few minutes each day.
Consistency really is key in so many areas, and language learning is no exception.
Oh.
I'm curious, does the guide suggest a specific amount of time or frequency for podcast listening?
It recommends aiming for at least 15-30 minutes each day. But the real magic is in finding what you can realistically stick with. If 10 minutes a day is all you can manage right now, that's perfectly fine. The key is to make it a habit, like brushing your teeth or grabbing that morning coffee.
It's about creating those little pockets of English immersion throughout your day, which I love because it's so flexible and accessible. You can literally learn English while doing almost anything.
Exactly. You can listen during your commute, while you're at the gym, cooking dinner, or even tackling those household chores. It's all about turning everyday activities into language learning opportunities.
It's like a secret language learning mission hidden within your daily routine. I'm curious, does the guide recommend specific types of podcasts depending on your learning goals?
The guide emphasizes that the best podcasts are always the ones that align with your interests. However, it does offer some helpful starting points for different levels and goals. For beginners, it suggests podcasts that focus on clear pronunciation, everyday vocabulary, and simple grammar structures.
Those foundational elements are so important for building confidence. What about intermediate learners who are looking to really expand their vocabulary and comprehension skills?
For intermediate learners, the guide recommends podcasts that feature interviews, storytelling, or discussions on a variety of topics. These types of podcasts expose you to a wider range of vocabulary and conversational styles, which helps you develop a more nuanced understanding of the language.
It's like stepping into different worlds and immersing yourself in the many ways English is used. What about those advanced learners who are already pretty comfortable with the language? What kind of podcasts would challenge them and help them refine their skills even further?
For advanced learners, the guide suggests exploring podcasts that tackle more complex topics like science, politics, philosophy, or literature. These podcasts often use sophisticated vocabulary, idiomatic expressions, and engage in nuanced discussions that can really stretch your understanding of the language.
It's like taking your English comprehension to the next level. I imagine listening to native speakers discussing these complex topics can also give you a deeper understanding of different cultures and perspectives.
Absolutely. It's a holistic approach to language learning that goes beyond just vocabulary and grammar. It's about broadening your horizons and connecting with the world through the power of language.
I love that. Now, we talked earlier about the importance of active listening, and one of the key techniques is note-taking. I'm wondering if the guide dives into any specific strategies for taking notes effectively.
It does. It offers some really practical tips. The first is to focus on keywords and key phrases rather than trying to write down every single word.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about capturing the essence of what you're hearing, not creating a word-for-word transcript of the entire episode. What else does the guide suggest?
It also recommends using abbreviations and symbols to save time and space. For example, BC for because or W for with. And don't be afraid to develop your own shorthand or personal symbols as long as you can decipher them later.
It's like creating your own personalized language learning code. What about using different colors or highlighters? Is that something the guide recommends?
Absolutely. Visual cues can be incredibly helpful for remembering things. You could use different colors to highlight different types of words like verbs, nouns, or adjectives, or use different highlighters to mark new vocabulary, important phrases, or even grammatical structures that you want to review later.
It's like turning your notes into a work of art that reflects your learning journey. I love that the guide encourages you to be creative and find what works best for your own unique learning style.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to note-taking. The key is to find a system that helps you engage with the material, retain information, and make those new words and phrases stick.
And speaking of making things stick, one of the most intriguing techniques we discussed earlier was shadowing.
Hmm.
Can you break down how that technique works and why it's so powerful for improving pronunciation and fluency?
Shadowing is all about mimicking the speaker's pronunciation and intonation by repeating what they say almost simultaneously. It's like you have a shadow that follows your every move. But in this case, it's your voice trailing the speaker's voice.
It sounds like a fun but challenging way to practice. How do you actually go about shadowing a podcast?
First, choose a short segment of the podcast, maybe just a sentence or two. Listen to that segment carefully, paying close attention to how the speaker pronounces each word, their rhythm, their intonation, all those little details. Then, try to repeat the segment out loud, mimicking the speaker as closely as you can.
It's like trying to synchronize your voice with the speakers. Any tips for making the most of this technique?
Focus on the sounds, the rhythm, and the flow of the language. Don't get too hung up on understanding every single word at first. The goal is to train your mouth and your ears to work together to produce and perceive the sounds of English more accurately.
It's like a workout for your tongue and your ears. I know English has some tricky sounds that many learners struggle with. Are there any specific ones that you've noticed come up frequently?
English has a wide variety of vowel and consonant sounds, and some of them can be a real challenge for learners, especially if their native language has a different sound system. For example, the th sound, like in think or this, can be particularly difficult for people whose native languages don't have that sound.
And of course, we can't forget those infamous vowel sounds that can be so subtle and hard to distinguish.
Exactly. The difference between ship and sheep or cat and cut can be very subtle, and mastering those nuances is essential for clear communication.
Shadowing sounds like an excellent way to fine-tune your pronunciation and develop a more natural-sounding accent.
It really is. It's a powerful tool for anyone, whether you're just starting out or are already quite fluent and looking to polish your speaking skills.
And as we mentioned before, it all comes down to practice and consistency. The more you shadow, the more comfortable and confident you'll become with the sounds of English.
Absolutely. And as you get better at shadowing, you can increase the difficulty. Start with single sentences, then move to longer phrases, and eventually you can even try shadowing entire conversations.
Wow, that's impressive. It's like taking your shadowing skills to the next level.
Okay.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to incorporate shadowing into my own routine.
I highly recommend it. It can truly unlock a whole new level of fluency and confidence in your spoken English.
And on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. Be sure to join us for the final part, part 3, where we'll explore even more advanced strategies for maximizing your language learning with podcasts, and dive into some really interesting techniques for vocabulary acquisition and conversation practice. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive on learning English with podcasts. It's been quite a journey exploring all these amazing tips and techniques from this comprehensive guide.
We've covered so much ground, from finding the perfect podcast and setting realistic goals to mastering those active listening techniques and even tackling the art of shadowing.
And of course, we can't forget about transcripts and subtitles, those secret weapons for visual learners like me. They're like having a language learning toolkit right at your fingertips.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I have a question that I think a lot of listeners might be wondering about. We talked about the importance of consistency and making podcast listening a part of our daily routines. But what about those times when life gets in the way and we miss a day or two? Does the guide offer any advice for getting back on track?
That's a great question, and it's something we all face at some point. Life can be unpredictable, and sometimes our routines get thrown off. The guide addresses this and emphasizes the importance of self-compassion and flexibility.
So it's not about beating ourselves up if we miss a day or two.
Exactly. It's about understanding that setbacks are a natural part of any learning process. The key is to just pick up where you left off and not let a few missed days derail your entire progress.
It's about focusing on the long game and not getting discouraged by minor bumps along the road. Does the guide offer any specific strategies for getting back on track when those inevitable setbacks happen?
It suggests a few helpful approaches. One is to simply acknowledge the missed days and move on without dwelling on them. Another is to adjust your schedule or routine to make it easier to fit in some podcast listening time.
So maybe instead of aiming for 30 minutes a day, adjust to 15 minutes if that's more manageable at the moment.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for your current situation and being kind to yourself throughout the process. The guide also reminds us that progress isn't always linear. Some days we might feel like we're making huge strides, while other days it might feel like we're barely moving forward.
It's like those video games where some levels are easier than others, and sometimes you have to replay a level a bunch of times before you can move on.
That's a great analogy, and just like in those video games, persistence and determination are key. The guide encourages us to celebrate those small wins, acknowledge the challenges, and keep moving forward, even if it's just one small step at a time.
It's all about embracing the journey with all its ups and downs and finding joy in the process of learning and growing. And speaking of growth, one of the key indicators of progress in language learning is expanding our vocabulary. Does the guide offer any tips for effectively learning and remembering new words?
The guide offers a number of practical strategies for expanding your vocabulary. One of the most effective is to create a personal vocabulary list or glossary. As you encounter new words in podcasts, simply jot them down in your list along with their definitions and maybe even an example sentence or two.
It's like building your own personalized dictionary filled with all these amazing new words. Does the guide suggest any specific methods for organizing or reviewing this vocabulary list?
It recommends reviewing your list regularly, maybe once a week, or even more often if you feel ambitious. Flashcards are another great tool, either the old school paper kind or digital ones. They can help you test your knowledge and really reinforce those words in your memory. And don't be afraid to get creative. You can use different colors, highlighters, or even drawings to make your vocabulary list more visually appealing and engaging.
It's about transforming your vocabulary list into a vibrant, interactive learning tool that reflects your personality and learning style. Are there any other techniques for reinforcing vocabulary that the guide recommends?
Another powerful technique is to actively use the new words you're learning, both in your speaking and writing. This active application helps solidify your understanding and makes those words feel more natural and familiar to you.
It's like taking those new words out for a test drive and seeing how they perform in real-world situations.
Yeah.
Does the guide offer any suggestions for creating opportunities to use these new words?
It recommends finding opportunities to practice speaking English with others, whether it's with a language partner, a conversation group, or even just talking to yourself. You can also try incorporating those new words into your writing journal entries, short stories, even social media posts.
It's about weaving those new words into the fabric of your everyday communication, making them an integral part of your active vocabulary. And speaking of active communication, one of the most valuable aspects of language learning is being able to understand and participate in conversations. Does the guide offer any specific tips for improving conversational skills through podcasts?
Absolutely. The guide highlights the importance of listening to podcasts that feature natural conversations between native speakers. This exposure helps you get familiar with the rhythm, flow, and nuances of how English is actually spoken in everyday life.
It's like immersing yourself in the natural habitat of the English language. Are there any specific types of podcasts that are especially helpful for developing conversational skills?
Podcasts that feature interviews, storytelling, or casual conversations between friends or colleagues tend to be really beneficial. These formats expose you to a variety of conversational styles and vocabulary, and they often involve those natural back-and-forth exchanges that help you build your listening and comprehension skills.
It's like observing the dynamics of real-life conversations and learning from the masters. Does the guide offer any specific techniques for actively practicing conversational skills while listening to these podcasts?
One technique is to pause the podcast after a speaker finishes a thought and try to summarize what they just said, but in your own words. This helps you practice your active listening and comprehension skills. Another technique is to imagine yourself participating in the conversation and come up with responses to the speaker's questions or comments.
It's like having a virtual conversation partner right there in your headphones. And as we continue to listen to podcasts and practice our conversational skills, we'll naturally start to internalize those patterns and rhythms of spoken English, becoming more fluent and confident communicators.
Exactly. It's a continuous journey of learning and growth, and podcasts provide an incredible resource for anyone who wants to improve their English and connect with the world in meaningful ways.
This deep dive has been such an enriching experience. We've uncovered a treasure trove of practical tips, insightful techniques, and inspiring strategies for making the most of podcasts for learning English.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you. And remember, the key is to find what works best for you, embrace the journey, and enjoy the process of learning and growing.
What stood out to you from our deep dive today?
I'm really intrigued by the idea of using podcasts not just for language acquisition, but also as a tool for cultural exploration and personal growth. It's about more than just learning words, it's about broadening your horizons and connecting with the world in meaningful ways. What are your thoughts?
For me, it's a focus on active listening and engaging with the material in a way that feels personalized and, most importantly, enjoyable. It's about making language learning an adventure, not just another chore in your to-do list.
I completely agree. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of learning English with podcasts. We hope this journey has been insightful, inspiring, and empowering for you. Remember, the power to unlock fluency and embrace the joy of language learning is right there in your pocket.
So go explore that vast world of podcasts, find what excites you, and embark on your own language learning adventure.